Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 1st of July of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to continue our talks about Sumy direction. If you remember, during the previous update we talked that according to Ukrainian sources, the Russian reconnaissance or sabotage group entered the village by the name of Zhuravka. The Ukrainians managed to discover the redeployment of Russian forces. They discovered a temporary position or some ammo depot or the warehouse in this area, and after that the Ukrainians bombed this territory with French-made Hammer bombs, and as a result of strike we see the secondary detonation, so most likely the Ukrainians managed to get something big. Later the Russian sources reported that the Russians entered not just Zhuravka but another village in the same area by the name of Veselovka. So summarizing everything, according to pro-Russian sources, the Russians established complete control over this territory during the previous let's say 24 hours. We don't know for sure whether the Russians entered this area forever, like to create long-term positions, or it was just a reconnaissance in force or in combat. Anyway, we see a certain activity of the Russian forces in this direction and some Russian interest in this area. I'll remind you that if we calculate the distance between the possible area where the Russians entered the area and let's say Sumy itself is less than 27 kilometers. So according to some different military experts, Sumy is also going a part of Russian offensive, or part of let's say directions of Russian offensive in the very near future. Now let's move to Kharkiv area. We have lots of artillery strikes in the area of the village by the name of Sotnitsky Kazachok. I'll remind you that Ukrainians also reported that during the previous days, during the previous months, the Russians entered Sotnitsky Kazachok as well. As a result of Reko in combat or another sabotage group was sent there. Anyway, summarizing everything, we see a very big Russian activity of sabotage groups along the borderlands with Sumy region. So, and this is very important because always sabotage groups is something like a first stage, first part before any ground operation for any party. Now let's move further in direction of Hlyboke, where the Ukrainians probably 10th day in a row tried to storm a small village, suffering significant losses. During the previous 24 hours there were more attempts from the Ukrainian side. In this video, for example, we can see armored personnel carrier moving on the let's say in the western side of the village, attacking the Russian positions inside, but the Russians managed to destroy the carrier with FPV drone strike most likely. On the other hand, we got another video how the Ukrainians managed to discover the concentration of Russian forces in the most northwestern part of Hlyboke, and as a result probably of Hammer or JDAM strike in this area, the Ukrainians managed to destroy temporary position of armored forces of Russian Federation. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are not limited with this type of weapon. They probably have some problems with the quantity of bombs, but we see that they're using this, and if the Ukrainians are using JDAM or Hammer bombs in this area, that confirms that this direction is the primary direction for the Ukrainians. On the other hand, we continue receiving updates of how the Russians were using FAB 3000. In this video, for example, the Russians, according to reconnaissance operation, the Russians managed to discover the positions of 30th brigade, and as a result of FAB 3000 strike, the temporary position of that brigade was completely destroyed. And we have reports that the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover a big concentration of vehicles in the inner street of a main post office in Kharkiv, and as a result either of Iskander or FAB bomb, this entire park was destroyed with significant number of vehicles that Ukrainians were using for supplying and supporting their forces along the line of combat contact. As for Volchansk, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received almost anything from this direction, so we are expecting for additional updates, and most likely tomorrow or the day after we're going to receive additional updates. Now let's move in the northern Kupiansk direction, where we got a lot of very interesting details. As you can see, we have a lot of icons along some line which can be used for finding and discovering of Russian artillery systems and forces that were attacking, like let's say a correct shape or something like this. Anyway, summarizing everything, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to secure the village by the name of Stepovo-Novoselovka and to force the Ukrainians to fall back further in the western direction towards the town by the name of Bishana. This is very important progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. The thing is that the distance between Stepovo, Novoselovka and Peshchana itself is around 5 kilometers. So it's significant distance both for the Russians and for the Ukrainians, because if the Russians are planning to move further in the western direction, they will be attacked by the Ukrainian FPV drones and Ukrainian artillery. The same thing about the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians decide to counterattack, they would be destroyed among the fields and these roads and the tree lines. So this is something like a barrier. It's not like the barrier that can't be passed either by the Russians or Ukrainians, but the further movements for both sides will be completely connected with significant losses. Anyway, the Russians are planning to move further. As we can see, we got additional updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions, all of the line of combat contact in deep rear in Kupiansk direction, lots of FAPs, lots of artillery strikes, lots of missiles and many other different types of weapon were used by the Russians during the previous days. Lots of FAPs, which is most important. We don't know for sure what are the real plans of the Russians in this direction, but obviously the thing that we can say for sure that the Russians are not going to stop. Now let's move further, and we're moving to Stelymakhovka. According to information we have, the Russians managed to reach the outskirts of the village. During the previous days we got a lot of updates that the Russians managed to capture the village itself, or at least to capture up to 50%. By the way, for example, in this video we can see a significant number of Russian infantry and troopers heading towards the village, but according to the Ukrainians, the village still remains under their control, and today we got the first geolocations confirming that as a result of another, let's say, waves of offensive operations, the Russians managed to reach the eastern outskirts of a village itself, and probably they're about to begin the final battle for this territory. I'll remind you that during the previous days we got updates that the Russians also captured these fields and these tree lines. I believe that most likely the fields and the tree lines between Novoselovska and this foothold is also either under Russian control or about to be captured by the Russians. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the village of Stelymakhovka is already semi-encircled from the south, from the southeast, from the east, from the northeast, and from the north. Berestova also, we have some reports during the previous days about additional progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. And here we can see the same story. If the Russians are able to reach this red line, then the next defense belt, the next village the Ukrainians can have under their, let's say, under their positions is Lazova and Nova Kruglikivka, and it's too far. It's too far, and there are lots of fields that is not very good defense positions, and in this, at least in this, let's say, stage of the special military operation. When talking about the south and Kupiansk direction, according to information we have, the Russians also began offensive operation towards the village by the name of Makeyevka. And we have lots of videos also with the use of significant number of armored vehicles, personnel carriers, on infantry heading towards the Ukrainian positions. The Russians were clearing and storming the trenches. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russians with cluster rounds with artilleries. And the last geolocation, the nearest to Makeyevka geolocation from the Russian side was discovered here. Before an offensive operation, the Russians attacked and bombed Makeyevka itself with accurate missiles. In this video we can see another strike with a Mul missile. As a result of this attack, the Ukrainians lost another temporary position, or maybe the headquarters or command center. Now we are moving further, and we are going to the Kreminna forest, where we also received significant number of updates, and the most important is this one. As you can see, according to information we have, according to information that was published by the Russian sources, the Ukrainians continued their offensive operation in Kreminna forest, and during the previous 24-48 hours, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions and to capture additional strongholds and the fortifications in this area, which is very important, because I'll remind you that summarizing everything during the previous few days, we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians managed to capture significant territories in this direction. I'll remind you that according to the previous updates and different mappers, the Ukrainians captured something like this just as a result of publishing the posts from different sources during the previous week. So this is obviously significant progress, as you can see. We can't tell for sure whether the Ukrainians managed to capture these territories, let's say just as a clashes of 1-2 days, or maybe as a result of months. But we haven't been receiving anything from this direction due to the lack of different, let's say, journalists or something like this. But anyway, we see that the progress was significant. And I'll remind you that the main, let's say, forces who is responsible for this operation from the Ukrainian side is the forces of the 12th Brigade of Special Purposes Azov. They are the core of this offensive operation. As you can see, they managed to improve positions significantly. We can tell for sure just about one thing, that Ukrainians, when they're doing these attacks, are planning probably not to capture Kreminna or to capture Severodonetsk or Lysychansk. The main purpose of these attacks from the Ukrainian side is to force the Russians to redeploy some reinforcements in the reserves from any other direction in this area, because the Ukrainians suffer significant problems everywhere, and just to slow down the Russians, at least somewhere the Ukrainians try to attack here, and maybe this will help them, maybe not. Anyway, if the Russians, probably the Russians will redeploy additional reinforcements in reserves. But summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainians are trying to get this line, so to capture the 3 lines, fortifications and forests up to this yellow line, and after that they're going to be very difficult to cross due to big distances between one fortified position and another. Now we are moving further in the direction of Siversk. As you can see, we haven't received almost anything here. As the same story about Chasiv Yar, nothing special, just a regular military activity. We got interesting details. I would like to discuss these details once again that are coming from Toretsk direction. Today, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that a large stronghold of the Ukraine armed forces on the eastern outskirts of the village of Kirova was captured by the Russians veterans detachment of the Center Group of troops using an underground tunnel or the pipeline. So the Russians are saying that, according to, as I understand, maybe I'm wrong, maybe in the next few days we're going to receive additional updates, but as I understand, the Russians were moving something like this along Siversk Donetsk-Donbass Canal, managed to bypass the Ukrainian defense belt, to land their infantry somewhere here, and to capture this big stronghold. So the Russians were moving something like this. At least this information we can read according to the Ministry of Defense. Of course, they're not providing us any coordinates or exact positions, but this is the only area that fits the description that the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation provided. And after the Russians captured the stronghold, the entire defense belt of Ukrainian armed force collapsed. I'm reminded that the Russians were conducting this operation exactly at the same time when the Ukrainians were making rotation of 24th Mechanized Brigade with 31st Mechanized Brigade. 24th was moved to Chasiv Yar, and 44th was moved back to the south in Toretsk, and probably they were new to this area and they basically was shocked. Maybe they were unexpected, they didn't expect this attack, and all those things led to one thing that we can see right now, the current configuration of the line of combat contact. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing, and today we got additional video of how the Russians were bombing Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian positions inside of Toretsk agglomeration, and the author of this video claims that under very heavy Russian artillery fire, the Ukrainians abandoned their positions and fell back towards the central part. The Russians were bombing this territory, and based on this geolocation, we can make a conclusion that maybe the Russians are planning to attack this way, trying to cut and establish physical control over Pionerov Ave, and in this case they will be able to cut the next citadel from the mainland from support, and this attack can allow the Russians also begin moving further in the southern direction towards New York, with the purpose to encircle this stronghold from the north and of course from the south, because today the Russians also published the video of how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in this area, trying to force them to fall back, and under very heavy artillery pressure and fire, the Ukrainians decided to fall back and to abandon their positions. So we see there's some kind of certain pressure of the Russians on the line Novosilovka, New York, and the same pressure from, let's say, Toretsk agglomeration to New York itself. So obviously the Russians do have some plans, further plans for this direction. Now let's move to the western Avdiivka area. Today we got geolocations confirms Russian control over this stronghold that located in the northern part of Sokol. Furthermore, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians captured Novopokrovska itself completely. This village was colored by different mappers, pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian neutral, a long time ago, but just today the Minister of Defense provided us the let's say final confirmation, which means means that the village was captured a long time ago, but the Russians been conducting lots of cleaning operations, demining process, and many other things in this area. Furthermore, during the previous day, we got additional batch of a significant number of destroyed Ukraine armored vehicles and just vehicles on the western part of Avdiivka with significant number of FPV drone strikes. This is the new, of course, Western weapon cemetery. Probably the Ukrainians lost armored vehicles, maybe more armored vehicles in this area, maybe twice as more armored vehicles in this area in comparison with Robotina, where the Ukrainians suffered the first losses in the Western weapon. Here, the Ukrainians lost not just Leopards, Bradleys, Max Pro Senators, also Abrams and many other different types of weapon. So, and the Russians, as we can see, continue destroying the Ukrainian positions and forcing them to fall back further in direction of Pokrovsk. Today, we got reports that the Russians, unconfirmed without geolocations, that the Russians established complete control over the village of Yasnobrodovka. Probably this is the third or fourth day in a row the Russians reported about this, but without any changes, as you can see on the ground. Now we are moving to the most interesting, to my mind, area. It's the positions of armored forces of Ukraine between Krasnohorivka, Maximilianovka, and Novomikhailivka. So this is the next defense belt of armored forces of Ukraine that basically is collapsing and collapsing and collapsing. You know that as for geolocations, we don't have anything from this area, but we have the statements of already famous A-79's Air Assault Brigade. They published today so many interesting updates that change the completely understanding of the situation. Let's start step by step. As for Krasnohorivka, the Ukrainians of 79th Brigade reported that this town we have lots of cases of mass surrendering of Ukrainian forces. We discussed this in the past already, that according to Krasnohorivka and according to 46th Brigade that is responsible for this direction, the Ukrainians prefer to send newly mobilized forces in this area with the purpose just to reduce losses among the veterans and very well prepared and old soldiers who've been fighting with Russians since the beginning of the special military operation. And due to these newly mobilized soldiers on the line of combat contact, as I told you, there are lots of cases when the Ukrainians surrender and abandon their positions. So hundreds probably of cases were already discovered inside of this village. About Maximilianovka, the Ukrainians reported that the Russians did manage to answer the village itself from the eastern part, and according to the 79th Brigade, most likely Maximilianovka will fall under very heavy Russian pressure and fire. He didn't tell us the exact days, but maybe week, 2 or months, and obviously before the end of summer, the Russians will begin the clashes for Kurachovo itself, according to the statement of the 79th Brigade. As for Konstantinivka, today in the morning we got reports that Ukrainians from the same 79th Brigade managed to, let's say, organize a counter-offensive operation, and the Ukrainians used the very experienced forces of 79th Brigade, and that they managed to enter Paraskovivka itself, and the Ukrainians started, let's call it, clearing the village, trying to force the Russians to fall back to Novomikhailivka. And a few hours later, we got another statement from the same brigade, and they were saying that there was a very long operational pause, mainly due to Russians. It was the Russians who started the operational pause because the Ukrainians were in defense. And the Ukrainians decided that if the Russians are in operational pause, that means that they have some problems, and it's good to start counterattacks just to check the situation. And that was the reason why they sent the professional stormtroopers towards Paraskovivka. But later, the 79th Brigade reported that when these guys entered Paraskovivka, they discovered the big concentration of very angry Russians who were about to begin the final battle for Konstantinivka. And the source from 79th Brigade reported that these guys of 79th Brigade entered Paraskovivka. It was like one-way ticket. So they're done. There is nobody else managed to survive. And after that, the Russians began offensive towards Konstantinivka from many directions. In those attacks, the Russians were using the tanks, armored vehicles, personnel carriers, infantry, with significant number of artillery strikes. The Russians were moving in 2 directions. The first one was inside direction of this residential area, another one on the southern parts towards the Konstantinovka itself. The Ukrainian sources published significant number of videos of how they were trying to repel the Russian attack. The Russians suffered losses. So anyway, summarizing everything, currently there is a real hit in this area, and this is the hottest area in the entire special military operation according to 79th Brigade, and very likely the Russians will be able to capture capture some positions and to establish the foothold in the southeastern part of the stronghold. Also, we got reports that the Russians continue their offensive on the line Stepnoye, Solotka, Vodiane, and of course the Russians suffered losses. We have the videos of another cemetery of Russian tanks somewhere in this area. So as I understand, that was a very big tank attack, but the Russians suffered losses and haven't managed to reach positions they were planning to. Also, we got lots of updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ugledar. So at the same time, some offensives in Konstantinivka, Vodiane, artillery strikes in Ugledar, and the most important updates are coming from Prichistovka. If you remember, during the previous days, we talked a lot that, according to my understanding of the situation, the Russians are about to begin another offensive in direction of this village as well. The main purpose of this attack is to cut supply and to collapse, to ruin Ukrainian logistics between Novoselovka Perva and, let's say, Ugledar area. And today we got interesting report, and from the Russian sources, the Ukrainians probably also understand that the Russians are about to begin offensive, and they began mining area, but the Russians managed to discover the positions of minefields, and as a result of very accurate mortar strike, the Russians just damaged one part of mines, and after that every single mine was destroyed as a result of fire in this area. So the Ukrainians waste one night for mining process, and the Russians demine this area just in one day. So this mine blockade, this mine block, confirms that Ukrainians are getting ready before the beginning of Russian attack to Prichistovka. As for Azhane, nothing special, just a regular military activity. The same story about Orekhov direction. The only thing we got is that Russians reported, Russian sources, about some artillery activity in Takmachka, but we haven't received any confirmations during the day about things of these things. So nothing happened. Also, we continue receiving reports along the border with Belarus. And today we got report that Belarus will be ready to use tactical nuclear weapon if a threat to its sovereignty arises, as said the Chief of General Staff of Armed Forces of Belarus, Pavel Muraveyko. Also, we reported and discussed days ago that Ukrainians conducted significant number of forces along the border with Belarus in this area. Also, we have a lot of reports that that NATO countries also concentrated significant number of forces along the border with Poland and along the border with Baltic states, and currently the group of forces of NATO and European countries that concentrate along the border with Belarus is around 100,000 soldiers, around 40,000 soldiers from the European countries side and around 60,000 from the Ukrainian side. Of course, this is not so many, but obviously, and Belarus is not a very big country as well, so they don't have a lot of forces, and even this 100,000 can be enough for making a lot of problems for these small countries that located that is something like a western shield of Russia. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.